you become, in a sense, storyless. Not because you stop telling stories about yourself, but because you know they're just stories. The fifth thing you lose is your ability to derive your sense of meaning and purpose from external goals and achievements. Before awakening, you probably organized your life around achieving things, getting an education, building a career, finding a partner, raising children, accumulating wealth or possessions or experiences. These goals gave your life direction and purpose. They provided a reason to get up in the morning, a way to measure your progress, a basis for feeling that your life was meaningful. But as you wake up, you begin to see through the logic of achievement. You recognize that every achievement is temporary, that everything you build will eventually crumble, that all your accomplishments will be forgotten. You see that the satisfaction of achievement is always fleeting. The moment you achieve something, your mind is already reaching for the next goal, never satisfied, never complete. More than that, you begin to question the whole framework of becoming, of trying to get somewhere other than where you are. You recognize that all this striving is based on the assumption that you're not enough as you are, that life is not enough as it is, that something is missing or wrong that needs to be fixed or achieved or acquired. And this assumption, you realize, is the source of tremendous suffering. Once you see this, you can't quite throw yourself into the pursuit of goals with the same wholehearted conviction you once had. You might still work, still create, still build things, but there's a different quality to it. You're not doing it to become someone, or to prove something, or to fill a lack. You're doing it because it's the natural expression of the moment, not because you believe it will finally make you complete. The sixth thing you lose is your fear of what others think of you in the old paralyzing way. Now, you don't lose all concern for others' opinions. That would be sociopathic. What you lose is the desperate, unconscious need for approval that governs so much of your behavior before awakening. You lose the automatic assumption that others' judgments of you are somehow more real or true than your own experience of yourself. Before awakening, you probably spent enormous amounts of energy managing your image, trying to control what others thought of you, adjusting your behavior to gain approval or avoid disapproval. This was exhausting, of course, but it seemed necessary because the opinions of others felt tremendously important, even definitive of who you were. But as you wake up, you recognize that what others think of you is really just what they think of the story they've told themselves about you, which has very little to do with who you actually are. You see that people's judgments say far more about them than they do about you. You recognize that seeking approval is a game you can never win, because even when you get it, it's never quite enough, and it can be withdrawn at any moment. Once you see this clearly, you can't go back to the old desperate seeking of approval. You might still appreciate it when people like you, but you don't need it in the same way. You can't be controlled by the threat of disapproval anymore, because you've seen through the illusion that others' opinions determine your worth. The seventh thing you lose is your ability to hate or blame in the old righteous way. Before awakening, you probably had clear ideas about who was good and who was bad, who was right and who was wrong. When people hurt you or others, you felt justified in your anger and condemnation. You believed in villains and victims, in evil people who deserved punishment. But as you wake up, you begin to see that everyone is acting out of their conditioning, their wounds, their fears. You see that the person who hurt you is themselves hurt, that cruelty comes from suffering, that ignorance is not the same as evil. You recognize that given the same conditioning and circumstances, you might very well do the same things they did. You see that judgment and condemnation don't actually help anything. They just create more suffering, more division, more conflict. This doesn't mean you become passive in the face of harm. You might still work to stop destructive behavior, to protect yourself and others. But you do it without the hatred, without the righteous condemnation, without the belief that you're fighting evil. You do it with a kind of sad understanding that suffering creates suffering, and that breaking this cycle requires something other than more hatred and blame. Once you've seen this, you can't go back to the simple morality of good guys and bad guys. You lose your capacity for righteous hatred. And this can be disorienting, because hatred often gave you energy, clarity, a sense of purpose. Without it, you have to find a different way of responding to the harm and ignorance in the world. The eighth thing you lose is your attachment to being consistent. Before awakening, you probably worked hard to maintain a consistent image of yourself. If you thought of yourself as a kind person, you felt compelled to always act kindly. If you saw yourself as intelligent, you couldn't allow yourself to appear foolish. If you believed certain things, you felt you had to defend those beliefs even when you began to doubt them. But as you wake up, you recognize that this insistence on consistency is just another form of imprisonment. You see that it's perfectly natural to contradict yourself, to change your mind, to be different in different situations. You realize that only dead things are completely consistent. Life is messy, contradictory, constantly changing. Once you see this, you can't maintain the old rigidity about being consistent. You become comfortable with paradox, with not knowing, with allowing yourself to be different today than you were yesterday. And this means you lose the security that comes from having a fixed position, a solid identity, a consistent set of beliefs to stand on. The ninth thing you lose is your tolerance for superficiality. Before awakening, you could probably engage in endless conversations about nothing, much the weather, sports, celebrities, trivial complaints and observations. These conversations served a social function, a way of passing time, of maintaining pleasant relations with others. They didn't require much depth or vulnerability or truth. But as you wake up, you find it increasingly difficult to participate in this kind of superficial exchange. Not because you're being judgmental or superior, but because you've tasted something deeper and the shallow waters no longer satisfy you. You want to talk about real things, the nature of existence, the meaning of suffering, what it means to be human. You want genuine connection, not just pleasant chit-chat. This makes social situations difficult because most people are not interested in or comfortable with the kind of depth you're seeking. They want to keep things light, keep things comfortable. And so you often find yourself either pretending to be interested in superficial conversation, which feels exhausting and false, or awkwardly trying to introduce more depth, which often makes people uncomfortable. You've lost your ability to be satisfied with the surface of things, and you can't get that back, even when it would be convenient to have it. The 10th and perhaps most significant thing you lose is your hope for a final arrival, for a point where everything will finally be okay, where all your questions will be answered, where you'll finally feel complete. Before awakening, you probably had some version of this hope. Maybe you thought that when you achieved certain goals, everything would be all right. Maybe you thought that if you found the right relationship or the right spiritual practice or the right understanding, you'd finally arrive at peace. But as you wake up, you recognize that there is no arrival. There's no point where everything is finally settled and complete. Life is a process, not a destination. Every answer leads to new questions. Every achievement opens onto new challenges. Every moment of peace is followed by new disturbance. This is not a problem to be solved. This is the nature of existence itself. Once you see this, you lose your hope for a final solution. And this can be devastating, because that hope was what kept you going, what made the struggle seem worthwhile. If there's no final arrival, what's the point of any of it? But here's the extraordinary thing. Once you lose all these things, your ability to take the social game seriously, your innocence about human motivation, your belief in a solid self, your attachment to your story, your need for external achievement, your desperate seeking of approval, your capacity for righteous hatred, your insistence on consistency, your tolerance for superficiality, and your hope for a final arrival, once you lose all of these things, something else becomes possible, something you couldn't have imagined before. You become free. Not free in the sense of having no constraints or responsibilities, but free in the sense of no longer being imprisoned by illusions. Free to simply be, without constantly trying to become something else. Free to engage with life as it actually is, rather than as you wish it were. Free to love without the desperate need to be loved in return. Free to act without the burden of protecting an image. Free to experience each moment freshly, without the overlay of stories and judgments. This freedom is not what you imagined. It's not blissful or comfortable or secure. It's more like standing on a vast, open plain with nothing to hold on to, nothing to hide behind, nothing to define you. It can be terrifying, but it's also the only thing that's truly real. Everything you lost was just a dream, a comfortable fiction. And while the dream provided a sense of security, it also kept you from actually living.